very interesting. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome everybody to tonight's online discussion on the US Midterm Elections 2022. And my name is Iris Müller. I'd like to welcome you warmly on behalf of the three institutions that organized this panel discussion tonight together. That's the Friedrich Nauman Foundation for Freedom, the AmerikaHaus NRW Association, and the Adult Education Center of Cologne. And thank you all for joining in tonight on this very important issue, because in about 2 weeks from now, on November 8th, US Americans are going to vote in the midterm congressional elections. And in this election, in the upcoming election, all the 435 seats in the House of Representatives are contested, and also 35 of the 100 seats in the US Senate. As you probably know, for the last 2 years since the last elections, the Democratic Party has held a very narrow majority in both the House and the Senate. And this, of course, has been helpful for President Joe Biden to pass the laws he wanted. And currently, the seats in the Senate are split 50-50 between the two parties, which means that Democrats only hold the majority because they can call on the vice president in the case of a tie vote. So the margin is very, very narrow, as narrow as it could be, probably. And in the House of Representatives, Democrats also hold power only by a very narrow margin. Historically, we know that the party in power in the White House typically loses seats during midterm elections. And now recent polling suggests that Republicans have a good chance of taking control of the House of Representatives, while on the other hand, Democrats have a chance to retain their majority in the Senate. But, you know, in general, the political situation today, shortly before the election, could basically hardly be more complicated. There are so many issues on the table: abortion, gun laws, inflation, and foreign policy issues. So that I'm very happy tonight we have three political experts here with us. We can welcome them as our guests. And I think Christopher, our moderator, is going to present them in about a minute. So three experts that are familiar with US politics, of course, and that are going to share their views on the upcoming election with us, and also on the question, what is at stake for the US and also for our transatlantic partnership. So thank you very much for participating on the panel: former Congressman Brian Biard, former Congressman Dave Trott, and US correspondent Rieke Havertz. It's a great honor to have you all here. And to everybody who is watching tonight, please feel free to ask your questions via the Q&A button in the chat box, so that Christopher can include your points in the debate as well. And finally, I'd like to thank everybody who made this discussion possible tonight, and that's the AmerikaHaus NRW Association again, and the Adult Education Center of Cologne, and also my colleagues, everybody also behind the scenes who made this possible. Thank you very much. So now I wish us all a very interesting evening, and I hand over to tonight's moderator, as I said, Christopher Ochoa, and he's a postdoc in political science at the University Duisburg-Essen. Thank you very much, and have an interesting talk.
Yes, thank you so much for this introduction. Good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be moderating tonight's event on the midterm elections. As an avid enthusiast and analyst of American politics, it's particularly special to have two former congressmen with us tonight to discuss the midterm elections, as well as the brilliant ZEIT contributor Rieke Havertz, who will all provide keen and important insight on the significance of the elections. It's also great to see that so many of you are attending tonight. So there's obviously here in Germany a lot of interest in this topic. And before I introduce tonight's great guests in more details, I'd like to briefly contextualize the midterms, as Iris just did a bit. So in exactly 2 weeks, at the halfway mark between presidential elections, Americans will be voting for a new House of Representatives and about 1/3 of the Senate. Additionally, there are some key gubernatorial elections being held in bellwether states, such as Florida, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. And as Iris mentioned, these elections will determine the balance of control in Congress and provide us with a first insight into how the 2024 presidential elections will shape up. Historically, Iris also mentioned this, the president's party takes a battering during the midterms. So considering this precedent and the fact that the control in Congress from the Democrats is at a nice edge, chances are particularly high that the Republicans will take back control, at least in the House. So this would potentially bring much of President Biden's agenda to a standstill, and could also have implications for us in Germany and Europe as the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues. In addition to the war, so much has happened since Joe Biden has taken power, some of which we'll definitely cover tonight: the corona crisis, the vaccine rollout, school shootings followed by gun reform, the first female African-American Supreme Court justice, the overturning of Roe versus Wade, as well as a significant inflation crisis that still continues until today. Joe Biden has also changed his tone, especially toward a part of the Republican Party since he's taken power. Initially, he had much more of a conciliatory tone of unification. But by September of this year, he became far more confrontational in his language, in a now infamous speech in Philadelphia, referring to Trump-supporting MAGA Republicans as semi-fascist and an existential threat to the republic. So as you can see, the stakes for the soul of America are high, and the rhetoric is as fiery as ever. So before we get into some of those fascinating issues, I'd like to briefly introduce our three guests. Congressman Brian Biard served as the Democratic representative from Washington State's 3rd Congressional District for 6 terms from 1999 to 2011. During his time in Congress, he was, among other things, member of the House Science Committee, the House Budget Committee, as well as the House Select Committee on Continuity in Government. Congressman Biard is now chair of the National Museum and Center for Science. Next, Congressman David Trott served as the Republican representative from Michigan's 11th Congressional District from 2015 to 2019. While in Congress, he was a member of the Committee on Financial Services, the Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as the Judiciary Committee. Congressman Trott, a recipient of many awards for his vast work in law and business, was particularly critical of former President Trump during and after his term in Congress. And last but not least, Rieke Havertz is ZEIT US correspondent in Washington, D.C. Besides work for the newspaper, she hosts a wonderful podcast for ZEIT in cooperation with Klaus Brinkbäumer of Central German Broadcasting called OK America, with a question mark, where they dig into the various complexities of American politics and culture by trying to understand America's intricacies and various passions. I really can only recommend this podcast for German-speaking audience members and those interested in transatlantic relations. It's really a great podcast. So to our guests, thank you so much for joining us. I really look forward to this conversation. Before we get started, I'll just repeat some of the organizational information you just mentioned. So audience members, please make sure to put your questions into the Q&A in German F&A section of this Zoom meeting. And after our discussion at around 7:20 or 7:30, I'll open the floor to the public so I can pose your questions to our three guests. All right, let's get started. So I'd like to begin with a brief conversation on the significance of midterm elections, particularly for a German and European audience, so they can better understand their implications for governance in America in general. So Congressman Biard, against the background of your vast experience in Congress, what particular meaning do midterm elections have? For example, compared to general elections?
Well, thank you, first of all, to Christopher and to Rieke and to Iris and the entire team who've invited us here. And Dave, it's great to see you and to be part of this with you. I think Dave and I are probably befuddled sometimes about our own politics, so we're looking forward to Rieke setting us straight here today and explaining what's going on. You know, as you all know, unlike a parliamentary system where the leader of the nation is chosen by the majority party, essentially, or a coalition, a majority coalition, it's very possible to have a split government at the federal level here, with the president from one party and the other party in either the House or Senate or both. Traditionally, the midterm elections have an opportunity for voters to sort of adjust the course or to express displeasure with the way the country's going or the leadership of an elected president. It seems it's a little different in this case. I think that was clearly the case in the midterm with President Trump. It's not so clear to me that people are so upset about a particular policy of President Biden so much as they're concerned about the economic status of the country and about issues like homelessness and crime and other things that they see as problematic. And I think there's a frustration with that. And then I think there's a combination of in some cases, the residual Trump voters just still angry about the last election, and then independent voters who are really not necessarily sure what the Democrats are about, and not necessarily happy with the status of the economy and stuff. So this may be a little different than some midterms, but that's the general perspective, I think.
Could you maybe say something about how much these races are not dominated by national issues? How much of a role do national issues versus local issues play in the elections?
Well, it's a little of both, almost always. It's depending on the local community, whatever local voters are seeing, and the advertising and the rhetoric of the candidates will focus on both, et cetera. I mean, the challenge is that if you've got some national issues like nationwide inflation and other issues like that, that will obviously impact the local. I'm sure Dave's got other insights into it too.
Yes, Congressman Trott, I'd love to hear your insights about what type of meaning midterm elections had for you and what you think about the midterm elections this time around.
Sure. Well, thanks, Christopher, and thanks everyone for organizing this. And Brian, nice to be with you. I think there are kind of two aspects to what the midterm elections mean. From a political standpoint, it's an opportunity to kind of weigh in on how the incumbent president is doing, and typically that the party in the White House suffers at the midterm, as you suggested. And it's also an opportunity for the base to get motivated by either a good result or a bad result, and that leads to better fundraising for one party or the other. I think it's become particularly problematic in recent years in our country because the midterm is, the party in power loses seats, and then we immediately in January start focusing on the 2024 presidential election. So unless the Democrats keep control of the House and keep control of the Senate, the midterms this year will result in really 2 years of little or nothing getting done in Washington, which is very unfortunate. I had a good friend, Brian, when I was in the House, John Delaney, Democrat from Maryland, who ran for president the last cycle, and he was kind of a moderate. He thought he might be the only moderate and have a chance to win. And he had a great expression in his book that he wrote, which is the cost of doing nothing is not nothing. Some of these problems that we need to work on, we need Congress to be effective in dealing with. And unless the Democrats keep control of the Congress, that will definitely be compromised after this midterm.
Yeah, Dave, it's in large part because it used to be that Democrats and Republicans could work together. They wouldn't agree on everything, but it wasn't scorched earth politics. It wasn't my goal in getting election is to tear down and block everything the other side does. That is tending to be the case much more now. And sadly, I'm not trying to be super partisan, but I think that's more the rhetoric one hears coming from the Republican candidates now. If you elect me, I will stop everything the Democrats ever did. We'll roll back the Affordable Care Act. We'll eliminate climate change legislation. We'll et cetera, et cetera. And that then makes it very hard. And our politics now are so divided in our country. It's very hard to cross the aisle. And with the departure of guys like me and guys like Dave, there's just not that centrist core to reach across the aisle anymore. And when you do, you pay a price politically.
Yeah, I mean, here's the hypothetical. So let's say the Republicans win control of the House. Kevin McCarthy becomes the Speaker. Do you think Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia, who is a bad person, a bad Republican, I consider her to be a domestic terrorist, do you think she's even going to allow Speaker McCarthy to have a meeting with Nancy Pelosi? They will never be allowed in the same room. And if he is in the same room with her, then there'll be a motion to vacate the chair like they did to Boehner, and they'll try and remove him as Speaker. So nothing will get done if the Republicans get control of the House.
Ms. Havertz, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. And if we take this hypothetical situation that Republicans come to power and governance comes to a standstill, what would the implications be potentially for Germany? And do you share this hypothetical situation as a probable outcome?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks for doing this very interesting discussion. I want to point out two things which I think are very important for this year's midterm elections, as you both already touched on. It's like, I think it's not hard, it's close to impossible in today's America to get everything done across the aisle. So these 2-year cycles of having congressional elections, it makes it so much harder for the government in this, like for now, Joe Biden, to get anything done. And I mean, for him, he got some stuff done in the first 2 years, I think more than a lot of people expected of him to get done. But in this hypothetical, but I think all pollsters think that the Democrats will at least lose one of the chambers, most likely the House, then Joe Biden won't get anything of his agenda done for the remaining 2 years of his first term. And that is bad, of course, for America. That's bad for the American people. And I think also it's going to be very interesting to see how many of those Marjorie Taylor Greenes will make it into the House of Representatives, because then we don't have politics anymore that is hard enough as it is, but then we have like extremism in the House of Representatives, then we have extreme voices there, and then we have like a circus. It's just a too nice word to put it, but then politics again shifts its focus in America from things that are actually that matter for the American people. And when you ask me about the impact for Germany, I mean, it's not only Germany, but if Joe Biden is in a gridlock with the Congress, then of course his whole focus and the focus of his party will, as soon as the midterms are over, focus on 2024. And then of course foreign policy, always a hard to sell issue for American people, will go further down on his like priority list. And also, I mean, the thing that I think in foreign policy matters most to all of us right now is the war against Ukraine that Russia has started, and how the West will support the Ukrainian effort in this war. And we already hear voices on the Hill saying if the Republican Party will dominate the House, they will not sign off on these aids anymore, as so far has like the US shown up with extreme military aid, financial aid, humanitarian aid, and Biden's Ukraine policy will probably shift if we come to a gridlock like that.
Thank you so much for these insights. Congressman Trott, you mentioned something about the progression or the evolution of the significance of these midterm elections. And I'm thinking currently of major midterm elections such as the one in '94, where there was a so-called Republican Revolution and the Republicans took back control during Bill Clinton's presidency. Many have called this midterm election, for the reasons you've all listed, as the most important midterm elections ever. Do you share this view as these being the most important midterm elections ever?
Well, I haven't really considered it, historically, whether it's the most important, but they're important for a few reasons. First, and I think there's already a question in the Q&A about this, which I think is a great question. I forgot who asked it, but are the Republicans going to, if they lose in Arizona, for example, are they going to say that the elections were rigged? That's a great disservice to our country, undermining the confidence of election integrity. If the Republicans get control of the House, is that going to lead to gridlock, more gridlock in Washington? Can Joe Biden, this is, I think Joe Biden, and I dealt with him a little bit in 2015 when he was vice president, and, he was much more, I think, capable then than he is today. Can the Democrats find a way after the midterms to figure out a way to challenge the Republicans? People ask me, I think Ron DeSantis is our next president, and I'm not a big Ron DeSantis fan. But I think it's an important midterm election, both from a policy standpoint, but also just from the future of democracy and whether the extremists, particularly in the Republican Party, are willing to back down, which I don't think they will. Some of their claims of election fraud and really the insurrection that happened on January 6th, still the Republicans haven't properly taken responsibility for.
Can I build on that a little bit, Dave? I agree entirely. A couple of things we haven't mentioned. One, not only are
you're just muted yourself there.
Thank you. I don't know how I did that. Not only are governors and members of Congress up for election, but the people who run our elections at the state level are also in many states up. There are secretaries of state in a number of states, and that's consequential because you have people running both that for that position and for gubernatorial positions and for the Congress who deny the validity of the last election and excuse and apologize. They don't even apologize. They just excuse and defend the January 6th insurrection or minimize it. So whatever we may say about the policy agenda in terms of whether climate change legislation or healthcare legislation or et cetera will pass, there's something far more existential to this. And that is that in spite of an unprecedented event since our Civil War, the attempt to disrupt a legitimate election by violent means, egged on by a president of the United States who condoned people who were threatening to kill his vice president and the Speaker of the House. That's how grave it is in our country. And in spite of that, we're saying that the party whose leadership condoned and provoked that may get elected into a majority of the House and Senate. That's of existential importance that supersedes virtually any policy concern. And it's shocking to me that you have an individual who was a former president of the United States, who is a narcissistic psychopath, and I'm a neuropsychologist by training, and I believe if you look in the official diagnostic criteria, he will fit that. And not only is he that, he condoned trying to disrupt the peaceful transition of power in a democracy. That's inexcusable. And how anybody can say, I'm going to, I mean, that should be your litmus test. You shouldn't say, where do you stand on gun rights or abortion or inflation? You should say, do you support a man and a leadership of a party that condone obstructing the legitimate transfer of power in a democratic society? If yes, then we've got a problem, and I'm not going to vote for you. Whatever. I don't care if it's a Democrat who says it. That transcends all the policy issues. And here we are looking at it right now.
But to add to that, the interesting thing is, and I can maybe from some personal experience, there was this recent New York Times poll that showed that a vast majority of American voters are very concerned about the future of democracy in the States, but at the same time, it's not their decisive issues when it comes to the midterm elections. And there were a considerable number of voters on both sides and also independents. I mean, the number of Democrats were rather small, but still they existed, that said, I would vote for a candidate that is an election denier if all the other issues that are very important to me are met. And I think that is just a poll that should gravely concern everyone who's worried about American democracy, because if I'm willing to vote for someone who says, I don't believe Joe Biden won the election, but hey, he cares about the economy, so I give him my vote, I think that is a very dangerous situation here. And then traditionally, midterm elections have a very low voter turnout. Low voter turnout traditionally helps more the Republican Party. So of course the Democrats try to mobilize a lot of voters. And if I read those polls, I'm like, how can you actually really do that? And then just last week, I've been in Texas to do on a reporting trip, and I'm normally based in DC. I don't have a car here because I don't need a car. DC is, I mean, you have public transportation, you have grocery stores around the corner, you can bike right through the city, which is amazing, because normally I live in Berlin and you're always scared to death to drive a bike in the States, but in DC it's fine. Texas, no way you ride a bike anywhere, no way you have like public transportation. I mean, I heard rumors there are buses in Houston, but I didn't find them and they didn't took me where I wanted to go. So I had this gigantic car, because of course all the rental car companies only have gigantic cars. Although I ordered a compact, I ended up with this huge thing that I had to climb into. And then I drove through Texas, and of course I had to stop for gas, and I had to pay more than $60 to fill that tank. And I've never in my 15 years plus in this country, going back and forth between the States and Germany, had I to pay that much to fill my tank. And I could understand for a second there why people, I mean, the $60 you have or you don't have to fill your car with gas, and you need your car to make a living in Texas, for example, or the very abstract idea of how threatened is my democracy. I can understand that if I'm standing there in that minute, but of course, on a much larger level, it just so concerns me that so many people here are still thinking, well, we'll be fine in the end. I mean, that was kind of the feeling after the 2020 election. Okay, we skipped, I mean, we made it. Okay, now we can go back to our own like small, like everyday living. And I get that, and I don't get that at the same time, which is like my big ambivalence being a foreign correspondent here.
We were seconds away. We were seconds away from not making it.
Well, absolutely, I agree.
We were that close. And now people are saying, yeah, but damn it, gas prices are so high. I'll vote for the guys who supported the autocrat. That's just, we'll see. Maybe they won't. Maybe people will rise up and say, no, I just can't do this. I will also say, I don't think the Democrats have been very effective in their messaging. We have not explained the good things that have happened. We've not adequately challenged the bad things that have happened or will happen. Like Dave was saying, if Marjorie Taylor Greene and the people who are emulating her get into office, the consequences will be very serious, and we will not be able to conduct responsible domestic or foreign policy, I don't think. And so, yeah, it is kind of shocking, Rieke, that people would say, yeah, my groceries cost more and my gasoline costs more, so that's going to drive me regardless of all the other factors. But maybe so.
And our country has certainly been divided before, right? We were divided in the Civil War and divided over civil rights and divided during the Vietnam War. But the questioning the integrity of the underlying election process is a kind of a new twist for us. And it's hard to imagine, I think about a democracy and a Congress that works in a way where Tip O'Neill and Reagan are having lunch together, and philosophically couldn't be more different, but they get along. They're having lunch together once a week, and they end up doing some work on some important issues, immigration and Social Security reform. And Reagan had a great approach. He said, "I'd rather have 70% of what I want than nothing." And we're leading to a point where no one's going to get anything and no problems are going to be addressed. But Christopher, you
yeah, Congressman Trott, I'd really like to expand on that with you, because you are obviously a member of Congress in the Republican Party. Could you maybe provide us some insight on how this kind of stark fractionalism, this polarization inside of the Republican Party has taken place? How did it come to this?
Well, that's a great question. And, I knew Trump before he ever ran, and I've been wrong about Trump all the way along. I never thought he would get the nomination. I never thought he would win. I thought once he won that maybe his CEO skills would be such that he could be an effective leader of a massive federal government. And I've been wrong on everything. And I think, and I'd love to hear Brian's analysis of Trump's psychological problems, because his training and his PhD would give better insight than anyone I know, perhaps. But he's unfit psychologically, mentally, emotionally, intellectually to be president. And so he has led the party down a path that has created so many of these problems. But there must be some underlying problem in our country that so many people would identify with the MAGA movement. And I don't know if it's a frustration with how their lives have played out or the impact of the world economy. So many of the MAGA Republicans are so vehemently opposed to immigration. Well, with 3% unemployment, I got news for you. We need immigration, okay? It needs to be organized, needs to be controlled, but we need immigrants in our country. So I don't know the reason why someone would be so disillusioned with our country that they would buy into what Donald Trump is saying and question election integrity and be so dissatisfied with their life in America that they would support some of the things that are happening. I don't understand why anyone with half a brain in their head could agree with a single thing that Marjorie Taylor Greene would say on any given day. It makes no sense to me, and it must be some dissatisfaction with what's happening in our country.
A couple sources that I find, and the first one should be terrifying, but to try to understand the movement, I think you're right, Dave. It is shocking to you hear the rhetoric, and you hear it's not just the policies, it's the process of thinking. It's almost pre-Renaissance. It's this paranoid ideation of believe what you heard some knucklehead say on the internet over the world's best scientists, believe some talk show radio host over panels of experts. It's this defiance of fact-based reasoning and thoughtful deliberation. The book that comes to mind, and the reason I've alluded to it being shocking, is Erich Fromm wrote Fear of Freedom during the rise of fascism in Germany, which many of the people viewing this will know his book quite well. And I've read it multiple times, and I will tell you, it still speaks very powerfully. And his basic premise is people feel, I mean, I'm summarizing a very complex book, but quite accessible book. Basically, they don't feel they have a personal identity, a personal, that they don't matter. So they throw their support behind this powerful leader, and it becomes the cult of personality. I mean, you have these people driving around with Trump flags in their pickup trucks. The subtleties of policy are not what they're about. It's a cult of personality now. And Fromm's book talks about the whys and the consequences of it. Another book that I think is very important to read is Anne Applebaum's book called The Twilight of Democracy. And I discussed it a little bit with folks on the screen beforehand. Anne Applebaum's book, The Twilight of Democracy, basically argues that this rise of authoritarianism around the world is being fueled by the kinds of desperation of the individual, but it's allowed autocrats who are basically thugs and to utilize their military power, their political power, their economic power to suppress dissent, to expand autocracies, and they work together as a network. Thus, you see Donald Trump actually said at one point, he and Kim Jong-un fell in love. He actually used those words. And he was very flattering to Putin, and he sucked up to the Saudis. It's autocrats and strongmen, Erdogan and Orban, and I mean, you know, on they go. So yet the American people, and this was sort of Riike's point earlier about the foreign policy of the US, if that ethos begins to drive our political foreign policy in the Congress as well as in the White House, the American people really need to understand the consequences of that.
Oh, I'm mute. Rookie Zoom mistake. I'm sorry about that. Just one add-on maybe, because you said it's the cult about the personality, and I agree, but also I think it goes further now. Dave, you already mentioned Ron DeSantis, and I agree with you. I think that he might as well be the next president. I wrote a profile on him. I saw him twice. It's not so hard to get close to him because he's very sketchy about his media appearances, and he doesn't talk to the mainstream media. I think for over a year now, he hasn't given any major news outlet an interview. He appears on Fox News if he pleases to. So I saw him twice, and I think if I would be the Democratic Party, I would be more scared of him than Donald Trump. And I think that's why this movement that Trump clearly created with the cult around his personality has moved on, because it's no longer just the personality, it's also what they stand for. It's the identity politics. And that is what scares me as an outside observer, that it's no longer, yeah, we can agree to disagree, or I want to live my life and I feel overlooked and I want someone to look at my lifestyle and stand for what I believe in, but I'm fine with whatever my neighbor is doing and living and how they choose to live. But I think that is no longer the case, because they say we are right about the way Americans should live, and you're right about your lifestyle. We only have 2 pronouns. We don't want gender ideology. And everyone else is wrong. And so they really, it's about the freedom of America, they say, but it's only their freedom, and everyone who's living a different lifestyle, and I mean, America has always been a very diverse country. And I mean, so many different people coming together, living under this cliche of the American dream, but living very individually, however they choose to live their life. And now they're saying, we are having it right, you are having it wrong, and there's no compromise, and you are a danger of our lifestyle. And I think that is very important to what's going to happen in the future elections.
And when those folks tell their neighbors they're wrong, when they say it, it's filled with hate, not just a disagreement. You know, if you look at one of the books that is the foundation of conservatism in America, The Conscience of a Conservative, written by Barry Goldwater in 1962, that is so far from the extremists in the Republican Party today, you wouldn't recognize it. You know, it's really Goldwater that today would be a libertarian, not a conservative Republican. And then one thing we haven't mentioned, and to your point, Christopher, your question a minute ago, there's no question social media has exacerbated all of these problems. So some knucklehead can read something on Facebook and believe it's absolutely true, and that just further causes them to be loyal and committed to MAGA and the Trump movement.
Well, and also Ron DeSantis doesn't need the New York Times to cater his message.
Right.
Well, the reason why DeSantis is more problematic to me than Trump is DeSantis is a very, very bright guy, knows how government works, and will accomplish legislatively many more things than Trump was able to, because he knows what he's doing. Trump, he just wanted to have someone in the room saying nice things to him. He didn't really care whether he accomplished anything legislatively.
That's right.
Yeah,
Rieke,
DeSantis also very disciplined. Sorry, Brian.
Yes.
No, your description of the politics, what's so hard to understand, and if you're not here is, and you are here, so you see it clearly. You know, in the old days, you had sort of a normal curve distribution of political ideology, and there were fairly large number of Democrats who could work pretty well with Republicans who worked pretty well with Democrats. You'd go to the polls and you'd see your neighbor who's a Republican, and you'd say, well, Bob, you know, I'm a Democrat, you're a Republican. We know we just canceled each other out. Let's go have breakfast together. I mean, really, that's how it used to work. And people had disagreements on policy, but they didn't say or think that the other side was evil. If you look at some recent Pew research, the curve's no longer normal, it's bimodal. It's like an inverted normal. And the numbers of Republicans in the middle or Democrats in the middle has gone down. Now, one thing I want to emphasize, we have to watch out for the false equivalency that, oh, there's extremists on both sides. There were no Democrats attacking the United States Capitol on January 6th that I know of. And there were no Democrats condoning that attack afterwards. So yeah, there are some Democrats who may be farther left than others, but this kind of authoritarianism is just not part of the Democratic Party. But this business of, I align with my party, not based just on what my party believes, but on hatred and vilification of the other party, that's a relatively new and dangerous phenomenon, probably not since our Civil War, I really think, to the degree we've got it now. And, you know, folks like Dave, I imagine you would have an awful time if you ran for re-election. I imagine your primary would be a terrifying thing.
Well, I wouldn't have been reelected in 2018 had I run. And I criticized Trump, and I realized the extent of the problem I was creating for myself when I suddenly got uninvited off of Air Force One.
Really?
And so I knew I was on his list. And, you know, as you know, Brian, politics is not a great profession for people that have thin skin.
Yeah.
It never made a lot of sense to me how sensitive Trump was to criticism. You know, if I was elected president of the United States, I would generally feel pretty good about myself. And if people criticized me, I would get on Air Force One and fly off to someplace interesting and say, well, they can have their opinion, but I'm still the president. But Trump was so, just could never handle criticism. And when I started criticizing him and then got a call at 8 o'clock at night not to go to Andrews Air Force Base, I realized I was in some trouble. And I wasn't going to stop criticizing him because he's been just perhaps the biggest threat, certainly in my lifetime, to our country.
Yeah, just look up the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual definition of narcissism. And it's just, you just check the boxes. You just check all the boxes. I mean, the tendency to, you have to adore him. Anybody who disagrees is evil and must be destroyed. It's 100% approbation or approval, and anything other or less than that is disloyal. You know, there's the founder of the African American Museum of History and Culture tells a story in his book about he was showing Donald Trump. This is a museum about the history of African Americans in the country, which of course started with slavery largely, and with some exceptions. But that was and Trump was looking at a picture of a slave ship, a Dutch slave ship, and it's a shocking picture of the bodies lined up in this slave ship. And he turns to the director of the museum, who's a Black American, and said, you know, they love me over there. My polling numbers are outrageous over there. They really love me in that country. Completely missing the point of the exhibition and turning it all about him. And that's Donald Trump. And the shocking thing is that people put up with that. If your daughter were dating such a person, you would say, get out of that relationship. This is a toxic human being. And then, I'm sure you struggle with it. There are so many colleagues and friends who I served with in the Congress who are Republicans, decent, good people, who have sold themselves and compromised themselves. And you know how and why they've done that. politics is not meant to be an easy thing. You sometimes have to criticize your own leader, and you sometimes have to do what you did, Dave. And I'm very troubled by the willingness of people to tolerate the banality and selfishness of evil for their own gain. And that, if folks on this call know more than we do about the dangers of that, but it's pretty troubling.
Well, we've had our new president for the past 2 years, thankfully, who has in many ways been a corrective to what happened during the Trump presidency. And I want to talk about the achievements, maybe the missteps of the Biden administration in the past 2 years. Congressman Trott, you were part of a coalition of independents and Republicans who supported President Biden in the 2020 election. Has President Biden lived up to your expectations? Has he been able to act as a corrective to what happened during the Trump administration? I'd love to hear your insights on that.
Well, I did endorse President Biden over Trump, not because I was particularly excited about his candidacy, and sadly, right before the election in 2020, I was on a radio show, and the person asked me what I thought of the candidates, and I kind of sarcastically said, "Well, we kind of have a choice between demented and dementia." And, a little bit of a sad commentary on our best and brightest. I mean, Trump is demented, and frankly, I think, Joe Biden's best days are behind him. That being said, I think he put together a far better team than Trump did in terms of his cabinet and people around him. That was greatly disappointing to me, the people that Trump surrounded himself with. You say a nice thing about Trump and you end up in his cabinet, and you have no business being there. And I'm happy that the extremes in the Democratic Party have let President Biden have some successes. Initially, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were digging in and I think creating some problems for President Biden, and they've backed off, and he's been able to accomplish some legislative goals, and I think that are important. We have a lot more work to do, but he's certainly far better than the alternative we had in 2020.
And I think we have to remember that a couple of things. First of all, we always talk about the Biden agenda. We have to, as members of the Congress, remind folks that Article 1 of our Constitution is the legislative branch. And now the president can have an agenda, but the Congress has to enact that agenda or enact their own agenda, which is often separate from the president. So we have to, I think, step up for a minute and say it's not all about Biden, nor is it all about Trump. But Dave's point about, I think there have been remarkable differences. If you just look at the professionalism of most of the folks in the cabinet, there's just a higher level of experience and gravitas, I think, in not all cases, but in many of the cases for sure. The also thing we have to remember what President Biden inherited, a pandemic, a recession driven by the pandemic, supply chain problems driven by that. The problem in Afghanistan exacerbated by Donald Trump having negotiated directly with the Taliban, promising to withdraw forces to the Taliban without talking to the Afghan government, telling the Ukrainians that they might get their weapons, but he'd like them to do him a favor first. I mean, the problems that Biden inherited were astonishing, and he has made a lot of progress. And I think the Democrats have not done a very good job of acknowledging the progress. Two other things that seem to me very important. The Democratic Party is just going to have to realize it can't continue to be a gerontocracy. Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, these are friends of mine and I like them, but it's time to there are two full generations behind them waiting for a chance. There's folks, Dave and my age, and we're already getting up there a little bit. I'm a little older than Dave, but then there's a whole host of folks from 35 to 55 that are super capable and far more savvy about what's going on in the world today. And we need our older leadership to step aside and give the youth a time. And I think that's part of the problem the Democrats have connecting myself right now. The last thing I'll say on that is one of the dangers of hyper-polarized politics is you get people on both sides who are elected who don't have to listen to the other side. because to get elected, all they have to do is appeal to their radical base, and they don't have to listen to any different perspectives. And so then they grow out of touch and the divide gets even bigger. And when you throw in gerrymandering and natural selection of where people live, that all makes it even harder.
Well, we'll be dealing with the ramifications of the Trump administration for some time to come, since he was indeed able to appoint 3 Supreme Court judges. And one of the most famous decisions, of course, was the landmark decision overturning Roe versus Wade last summer. Ms. Havertz, you mentioned in an article that this decision to overturn Roe versus Wade had taken the United States back to the 1950s, and also mentioned that this was the beginning of attacks on more guaranteed rights through the Supreme Court, such as marriage equality. What's been your impression of campaigning on this topic of abortion during the midterm elections after the decision in the Supreme Court?
It's been really interesting because, of course, initially that Supreme Court decision electrified the Republican Party, because finally they achieved what they always campaigned on. And I think they thought that would give them a lot of momentum for, hey, we deliver, and this is going to be our top priority topic for the midterms. But then it shifted. It was so interesting to see, because, of course, it also mobilized Democrats saying, look at what is happening, as I wrote in that piece, that this is like this throws back our society like for years to come. And with this Supreme Court, and this is, I mean, Supreme Court judges appointed by like for life. I mean, this is not as in Germany that after 15 years so you're done. I mean, they can go on for a long time with a comfortable conservative majority. And the idea that the Supreme Court is really like one of the pillars of the checks and balances system, that's long gone. It's a politically active body of the government, because both parties choose this to be that way because they couldn't get anything done anymore, and every like major piece of legislation ended up in front of the Supreme Court. So both parties, when they were had the presidency, they tried to, like, of course, push judges that would more lean towards either or side, conservative or Democrat. So with this Supreme Court, and of course, Democrats fear that a lot of more issues might be at stake here. And so it mobilized the Democrats and the Democratic base. And then we had a very interesting vote in Kansas, which is deeply Republican. It was shortly after Roe v. Wade was overturned, and the Republicans pushed for like a very strict abortion law in the state, and the majority of voters, it was a clear majority that voted against it, that said, no, we don't want that. And polls showed that the majority of voters in this country are for some sort of abortion rights. I mean, restricted and limited. And it was not that Roe v. Wade was like some like get out of, I mean, it was not a free ride to whatever you want to do, you got to do. I mean, there were restrictions on how a woman could have an abortion, but it was still, it guaranteed a woman the choice to make that choice. I mean, she had a choice, and now this choice is taken away from women, and they cannot decide what happens with their own body. And of course, that's of grave concern. And so this shifted, the momentum all of a sudden went back to the Democrats. And you could tell there was a special election in New York where a Democrat solely ran on the abortion topic, and he won. And so that energized the Democratic Party prior to the midterm, saying, okay, this can be a winning issue for us. We can mobilize, voter turnout very important, and this midterm might not be as disastrous for us as we thought it would be. But now it turned once more, because now we're 2 weeks away from the election, and the abortion issue is no longer top priority. It's no longer in the news that much. It's no longer, I mean, people analyze the Google searches. It went down significantly. People don't look that up anymore. So often it's like, it's the short-term memory of voters. Now that's gone now. And now we're caring more about the economy again. And so now Democrats fear maybe it won't push us over certain edges and certain races. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that is going to affect the midterms, and that we probably won't see until it's over. But I think it's still a very important issue for the Democrats. I think it's a very important issue for the country. I don't know if it's going to be a very decisive issue in 2 weeks.
Rieke, I echo everything you said. You've analyzed it very accurately. You know, one of the things that is particularly troubling about our Supreme Court is not just the outcome of the decisions they're making, but the quality of their arguments and the origin. If you look at the abortion ruling itself, justices who wrote the dominant opinion were actually citing legal precedents that go back to the ages in which we burned witches. When we burned witches, women, accusing them of witchcraft. Literally, they were tracing legal documents. So when you go back to the start, where'd that come from? It came from a guy who was defending the burning of witches. And they have been making other decisions that are just based on things. They literally make statements that are factually not true. They're ruling on whether or not a football coach in my own state of Washington could engage in prayers after a football game, which was a separation of church and state issue for many. There are false statements made about that case in the Supreme Court ruling. And there are multiple other examples of that, which means that we're starting to make ruling not based necessarily on objective analysis of legal facts and precedent, but we're trying to make our decision first and then selectively pick. And last but not least, the fact that the wife of a sitting Supreme Court justice was actively and continues to be actively engaged in election denial. And he sees no need to recuse himself from that on possible conflict of interest grounds is pretty troubling. I mean, I realize that as I say all this, I'm painting a pretty grim picture of where things are in our country right now. And I'm sorry about that because I know it has international ramifications. But at the same time, I think we really have to understand, last thing about the Supreme Court, understand that many, if not most, of the Trump nominees for the Supreme Court, and remember that there was a blockage of Democratic nominees for that position, but not only for the Supreme Court, but the federal courts. Many of those have been pushed by a pretty far right organization called the Federalist Society, ironically named, if you know our history at all, but the Federalist Society, which just got $1 billion contribution from a wealthy benefactor. And the influence of these large, massive amounts of money from independent individuals buying dark political ads or controlling and recommending nominees to the court and taking battles on down to the lowest level of our governments, you know, the local city elections, local courts, local school boards, is also rather unprecedented in our history.
I think such an important point you're talking about, this packing of the courts, and it's not only the Supreme Courts, but it goes down every stage, and that's been a very smart Republican playbook because they, I think, anticipated way better than the Democrats that is going to be one of the decisive things to do if you want to control certain things, and they were very successful in that. And that, I think, Mitch McConnell, I mean, it's one of his career achievements that he packed a lot of courts.
You know, I agree with everything that's been said, and you know, we painted a pretty sad picture of the state of our politics and our government. And before I respond on the Supreme Court and abortion discussion, I like to call a Churchill quote, which is, you know, the Americans always get it right after they've tried everything else, and we're in the process of just trying everything else, and maybe we'll find our way through all this. But I agree that, you know, McConnell's number one priority has always been the court. He played games with the Merrick Garland nomination. And now we have a politicized Supreme Court. And we saw it yesterday with Clarence Thomas blocking the order that required Lindsey Graham testify in the Georgia case. I think that was a political decision. And that just further contributes to, you know, the unrest among voters and our citizens, because now we don't even have confidence in the Supreme Court. And it's creating another problem, too, for McConnell. Be careful what you ask for. You know, one of the things we haven't discussed is something that McConnell referenced a while back, which is the quality of candidates issue. And some of the Republican candidates particularly are so extreme that they probably, you know, but if we had normal candidates in the Republican equation, we wouldn't have a problem in Georgia right now. We wouldn't have a problem in Arizona right now. We wouldn't have a problem in New Hampshire right now. And the Republicans most assuredly would get control of the Senate. But the abortion decision particularly has caused some of these candidates who are on the fringes and our MAGA folks to get the nomination in the primary process, and those folks may not win the general. And right now, I kind of thought we might be getting more into the nuts and bolts of the elections. I mean, I think there's 13 senatorial elections that are kind of in play, including, I read recently, Brian, Washington and Senator Murray. I can't believe she is in jeopardy. But I think it ends up 50-50, and the Democrats keep control of the Senate because of Vice President Harris. And that's largely due to the quality of candidates, which is largely due to the abortion issue.
And not just the abortion issue, I think, Dave, but some of those candidates were chosen. They were chosen because they were loyal to Trump,
right?
Not because of their qualifications as statespersons. Or, I mean, if you look at Herschel Walker in Georgia, for goodness sakes, this is a man who the list is so long of why he's not qualified. But the same is true of a number of the candidates that have been. The shocking thing is that they're even close. The shocking is that that these people, if you looked at them on paper and you said, this is this person's resume, this qualifies them to be in the so-called greatest deliberative body in America, some say in the world, it sure speaks ill of the deliberative body and of the party if that's the best they can do. But that's because the Trump voters moved in the primaries and elected the extremes. And that's the problem. Is, like I say, people like yourself, Dave, would not have been elected. And you should. You're the kind of person we need in there. And we're losing that. And that's because of the litmus test was not, is this person qualified and are they motivated to serve? And do they have a resume that will prepare them? It was simply, will they deny the election and defend Donald Trump? It truly was.
Which of course leaves the question, and I know I'm not the one supposed to be asking the question, but of course I can help myself because I'm a journalist. Where is the future of conservatism in America that is not MAGA conservatism, but just, I mean, we talked about a lot of times where conservatism, it's totally fine to vote conservative, but so where is the future of that part? And Dave, I think I direct that to you. Like, where do you see the future of that?
Well, I think at some point Trump has to fade from our national discussion, you would think. And let's assume for the moment that he isn't elected president in 2024. Then at that point, you would think that he would become less relevant simply because of his age and his election failures. You would think that at that point, maybe we would move beyond that. What our country needs is a president who is a moderate, who is maybe focused on getting as much done in one term as he or she could possibly accomplish, and then running for re-election, not by pandering to the extremes of the party, but pointing to a record of accomplishment. Maybe someone like Buttigieg, who could come in and be a clear voice in a different generation and have some successes. Maybe that person can pull our country together. DeSantis is not that person. Trump certainly isn't that person. Larry Hogan from Maryland could be that person, but he has no chance of winning the Republican primary. So to your question, I think we're 5 years at least away from the Republican Party reorganizing itself into any kind of meaningfully productive organization.
Dave, you talked earlier about the contrast of Barry Goldwater. I don't think Ronald Reagan would have a chance.
No.
I can imagine. And, you mentioned earlier Mitch McConnell, the Senate majority or minority leader now, but look what Trump did to him. McConnell supported almost every Trump judicial nominee, blocked the Democratic judicial nominees, supported almost everything Trump did. After the January 6th insurrection, McConnell's wife, who was the Secretary of Transportation, right? Is of Asian descent, ancestry. Donald Trump, this is a person who was his cabinet secretary. She was in line to become the president if there were enough vacancies. He called her Coco Chow, simply because she criticized an attack on the White House and wouldn't support the president. He turned on her instantaneously, but not just saying, well, I disagree with her, but then assaulted her in a racist attack on the wife of the Senate Majority Leader. That's the kind of man that was in charge of our country and is still the figurehead of this party.
One thing that's been mentioned in passing, but the other problem with this whole process, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, is look at the Wisconsin Senate race. It's a $200 million race. We have a congressional race in my part of Michigan that might approach $100 million, Alyssa Slotkin's race for re-election. And all that means is if you're in the House, you know, after I got reelected in 2016, Kevin McCarthy pulled me aside, and here are his exact words to me. Dave, you had an easy reelect this time because you had a weak opponent who didn't spend any of his own money to fight you. But next time in 2018, you're going to have a target on your back, and you need to go across the street to the NRCC, that's the dial, and dial for dollars and spend all your time there. Don't worry about your committee work. Don't worry about legislating. We'll give you a nice bill to protect widows of firemen for your campaign commercials. Just go raise the money to get reelected. It'll be a $30 million race. And I said, Kevin, it's not gonna be a $30 million race. It was a $30 million race. It was an open seat. But all I would have done from 2016 to 2018, had I been standing for reelection, was dialing for dollars and raising money. And, you know, contrast that to John Quincy Adams in 1836 running for reelection to the House. He spent $5 on flyers and a week on horseback. Right?
I could do that.
Right.
Right. You're right, Dave. That's the money. And even if you raised all that money, Dave, even if you had raised $30 million, some super rich guy with his checkbook, you'd spend 2 full years of your life on the phone begging for money at breakfasts and dinners and lunches on the phone. And then some rich guy goes, the Committee to Protect Puppies from Dave Trott.
Right.
And they can literally write a $50 million check in 2 minutes, send it to a dark money PAC, and they can say anything they want about you. No accountability, no transparency, no repercussions for them whatsoever. And that's truly the situation now. And it's played out. We have individuals writing 40, 50, $60 million worth of dark money contributions.
Sorry to get off topic, but I agree.
No problem. Before I open the floor to the questions from the public, I'd like to pose one more question, and it actually involves Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who in the past few weeks, I believe a month ago, said that he's calling Ukraine aid into question if the Republicans take power in the House and Senate. And yesterday, a group of progressives came out and said that President Biden needs to reconsider his approach to Ukraine and take a more conciliatory tone towards Russia and find a diplomatic solution to the crisis. Ms. Havertz, what would the implications of this be for Germany if this were to happen, if Leader McCarthy were to become Speaker of the House and go through with what he's saying? What would this mean for Germany?
Well, it would mean, first of all, for Ukraine, and I think that is the most important party here in question, that would mean that probably the aid coming from the United States would be significantly less. I think what Biden has done so far, and with a great amount of commitment, which I salute him for, because it's not easy to keep that up for such a long period of time. We're facing a very, or the Ukraine is facing a very harsh, dark winter, and with it, of course, the whole Western Alliance facing this war and this conflict with Russia. We don't know what's going to happen over the next couple of months. So, of course, it's very critical from my point of view that the aid will continue to go to Ukraine, and the United States are clearly still on top of that when you look at the numbers. And of course, if the Republicans, and I think foremost the MAGA Republicans, have a strong voice in the House of Representatives, it will change the policy of Biden, and with that, the pressure will rise on the other NATO allies and on Germany to do more. I mean, pressure is already high on Germany within the European Union, being, one of the wealthiest countries, to do more. We were criticized a lot about our stance on, because we're so independent on Russian gas, and of course, Scholz has been criticized a lot in how he handled the whole situation. And I think the pressure for Germany will rise tremendously to do more, to give more money and weapons, tanks. I mean, that debate will continue and it will get stronger. So, of course, I think not for us as Germans so much as for the Ukrainian people, it's critical that the United States, one of the major players in this conflict, can continue to give more. And I think also the European Union and France and Germany need to step up as well. But if the United States is deteriorating I mean, how much can the European Union do to match that deterioration? That's going to be the question.
Politically, it's really important to understand that the power of the purse, as we say, the control of spending resides with the Congress. And so if Kevin McCarthy is in the majority position in the House and the MAGA Republicans are in charge, or at least they may not have a majority, the real extremes, but if they have enough that they can block his other agendas, the ability of the president to support arms shipments to Ukraine or other shipments can be constrained by the appropriations process, the process by which our Congress allocates money. They can introduce legislation that says no federal funding can be spent in this way, blah, 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 and they fill in the blank. And they said to ship arms of this sort to Ukraine. And that's the danger, is that they can tie the hands of the president and then tie the hands of Europe. And the long-term danger of allowing Putin to succeed in Ukraine is just quite terrifying. And what they'll do is they'll say, oh, in fact, a candidate in my old district, Dave, running against a woman you served with, Jamie Herrera Butler, the candidate against her is a complete Trump acolyte. Yep. His argument is the biggest threat to American security is our southern border. We shouldn't spend any money anywhere else except on the border with Mexico. He has, and now this fellow had served in Iraq actually, but he has no respect for what happens. And this is a Republican, in quotes, conservative, apologizing and defending Putin. I mean, he's literally criticized Zelensky and defended Putin and said we shouldn't spend money to protect a democratic country that's been invaded by a Russian communist nation. And that's the danger. So it is very grave. I hope one thing I think we need to do, we're talking about how grave it is in the US right now, and I think it is, but I think Europe can help us. I really think Europeans, we need a few things. We need Europe to come out and say, basically publicly, that America's got to get its act together, that we have to find ways to work together for the good of the country and for the good of the world. And I also think we need to have a revisitation of our international relations in the following sense. The UN has not been working very well. Many of our larger, the G20, et cetera, they overlook dictatorships. I think we're going to need to form an alliance of democratic societies with free market economies that agree to work together and reduce our economic dependence on totalitarian states by trading agreements, by shared manufacturing agreements in a constructive way, because we cannot be dependent as we have been for energy or microchips or rare earth metals or minerals. We've got to come up with an alliance that's different than the existing structures where free markets and democratic values support one another worldwide and reduce dependence on totalitarian states.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you said, Brian. And Reagan used to say, peace through strength. And I think we have to stand with Ukraine. And one thing I found, and this is maybe inappropriate to say, but I'll say it anyway, because I don't worry about what Kevin McCarthy thinks of me anymore. But, I never found Kevin to be that bright. Okay. And when he becomes speaker, all of you listen to his press conferences. I guarantee you, every time he holds a press conference, at some point, and I'm not being an elitist here, but at some point, he will use the wrong verb tense. So just stay tuned for that. And that will be disappointing to you as you watch our new speaker articulate our policy. And his comments about Ukraine, he could have thrown the raw meat to the extremes of the Republican Party in a different way. He could have said, we have a $31 trillion deficit or national debt, and we need to be careful how we're spending our money. And we want to make sure that it's being spent wisely and we're supporting Ukraine against the Russian aggression. And that would have maybe been sufficient. But saying there's no blank checks and we're going to have to stop it, they're suggesting that that's not productive. And Putin, it was a good day for Putin. As far as what the Democrats did, I have more respect for that, which is they're just trying to find an off-ramp for Putin. And a minority group of Democrats suggested that they have conversations. I don't think that's nearly as detrimental or as undermining our policy as what McCarthy did.
I would add too, they and the person who led that was from my state, the head of the Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, but they walked that statement back a good bit later in the day, which I was glad to see, because the initial statement was interpreted as sort of undermining Biden and undermining support for Ukraine. And they came back and said, no, 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 we support Ukraine. We support providing weapons. We support funding, but we also need negotiation. And so even the Progressive Caucus walked it back, which is completely different than people who on the right who are saying that Zelensky's a thug and that Putin was justified and that et cetera, et cetera.
Let me open the floor to a couple of questions from the audience. And we have a question from Romina Klinger that touches on the topic, which we've discussed extensively tonight, on what motivates people like DeSantis, like Taylor Greene, to get into politics. Is it just about being in power? And do they not see the kind of destructive energy behind what they're doing? And that it's a problem for the standing of the United States worldwide in the long run? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Dave?
Well, I think there are a lot of Republicans, particularly who support MAGA because they want to stay in office and they have no other priority other than getting reelected. And they can sleep at night because they can suggest that what they're doing is in the best interest of our country, although I strongly disagree. But I think it's job security and survival that is motivating many people. And that's, that's a fundamental problem, I suggest.
You have to understand that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Boebert and others, they get a big rush out of what they do. They get up on stage and they say crazy stuff. They say paranoid, delusional, conspiratorial things. And people don't say, what did you just say? Wait, pause. Show me the facts. I don't believe that. They cheer and they say, yeah. In the early days of the Tea Party movement, Dave, I had a town hall with 3,500 people at it. We had it in a rock amphitheater. It was about the Affordable Care Act. And people could get up and say nuts things, just crazy things, and get huge applause. And if you tried to return it to facts, you would get people shouting you down and calling you a liar. People are saying that we have a program in America called AmericaHaus, which provides modest stipends for education for young people who spend a year of their life serving their community. Maybe they're planting trees in a national forest, helping kids to read, working on infrastructure, whatever. They're mostly young people. We had people at that town hall, Dave, saying it was Obama's secret army in preparation for a revolution to take over the country. It was completely nuts. 3,000 people applauded. So Marjorie Taylor Greene and Boebert and others see themselves as heroes, as cultural heroes, daring to stand up against the establishment, daring to tell the truth about things. The number of times those people have said that the Democrats are child sex predators and have, engaged in child sex trafficking, crazy stuff. They have a whole base on the internet, a fundraising base, and people buy it. And so it's not, and for some of them, I think they actually believe it. I think the Boeberts and the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, they actually believe their rhetoric, and that's part of but you cannot reason with them. That's the hard part about a paranoid, is you can't reason with them because you're part of the conspiracy. So whatever you say just proves how conspiratorial you are. That's the craziness. It's really a dangerous thing. But again, we've seen this in other totalitarian states.
Brian, my son spent 2 years teaching with AmericaHaus. It was a great program. I had a great experience. And the other motivation I forgot to mention, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world may have, is they create such a following that if they ever get tired of elective politics, they can go sign $1 million a year contract with Fox and be a talking head. And that's more money than they'll ever see in their life. And so that's certainly probably a secondary motivation for some of these folks, which is what their career or life's going to be like post-Congress, which is also unfortunate.
There's a whole circuit of people who travel the country making tons of money on election denial, showing specious graphs and fake information, and this guy D'Souza, people who make these movies, totally false. I mean, based on spurious things, false claims, but people pay good money to go to them because it reifies their paranoid ideology. And you see the signs up in front of people's houses about this crazy stuff. So they make good money on it.
We have another question from wurde, who asks, how likely is it then, considering these extremist forces in the Republican Party, that the GOP splits? Rieke, Havertz, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't think so. Just because, as we just talked about, this country and politics in this country is run by money. And if you would try to split the party, I think it would be so hard to, I mean, we saw the Tea Party movement. That was one, it was not splitting, but it was clearly an attempt to push for something else. And it didn't really work out in the end. I mean, it's not around, but it's not big anymore. Now is MAGA there. And I think MAGA is going to be, I agree with David, will take a couple of years for the Republican Party to be somewhat of a functioning governing body. And it really should concern us because this is a two-party political system. But we get this question a lot also in the podcast. Why don't change the system, have a multi-party system, and the GOP should split? And I don't think the layout of this political system, A, doesn't agree with the multi-party system, and B, the money part. I don't think it's going to be so hard to really do something on your own, get the money for it, and you need the money here to win. Without the money, you don't stand a chance. And I think that is why I don't see anyone really pursuing splitting away from the party anytime soon.
Yeah, my hope in 2020 was that Bloomberg would use his $1 billion to start a third party. And that obviously didn't happen. Liz Cheney's talking about running as an independent in a few years. That will have little or no traction because of the lack of funding. Ross Perot ran in '92. He got 19% of the vote, and that's why Bill Clinton was elected. And that's the last serious third party candidate we had, but he only got 19% of the vote. I've been talking lately, we need a return of the Bull Moose Party and Teddy Roosevelt. And if you look at the platform of the Bull Moose Party, there are a lot of Republicans who are worried about our climate, who believe in some level of a safety net for those who need help in our society, and who believes corporations are taking advantage of the perks that they have. That was the Bull Moose Party. We need that to come back as a third party in this country, but it will be a long time before that happens, unfortunately.
You're right, Dave. You would need somebody at the front of the ticket who's really appealing. I mean, Bloomberg had two problems. One, he wasn't prepared for the job. He's a brilliant guy. He's a good guy, good values in a lot of cases, but he made it about himself. And when he was asked questions about fundamental things like how would you deal with healthcare and things, he couldn't answer them. And he'd never had to answer. You're the CEO, you're one of the richest guys in the world. You don't go to a board meeting and have somebody say, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask you a tough question. You better be able to answer it. They don't do that. So he suddenly thinks he's chairman of the board. You're right. He should have been a more attractive, more prepared figure. And I like him and I respect him, but his campaign was not well run. And he should have instead said, this is not about me, Mike Bloomberg. It's about creating a new movement. And we have people like David Petraeus. I'm a huge admirer of General David Petraeus. We have people who would be fantastic presidents. But we need the money. And the other thing that's hard for people to understand is each state has its own rules for how people get on the ballot to be the president. And it's actually really difficult. It's difficult for third-party candidates to even get on the ballot in some states, and then just cutting through the great inertia of the two parties. But I think there is a need. There's certainly a need for centrist and moderate Republicans to have a place to go. And the truth is, in cities like Seattle, centrist Democrats feel they don't have a place to go either. They feel oftentimes the far left in Seattle's city politics has dominated for far too long.
Well, this connects to another question posed by wurde. What could the Democrats do better to attract independents and moderate Republican voters, Congressman Biard?
Well, I think, the interesting thing is Democrats have actually done a lot of pretty good stuff. We just haven't sold it very well. We have people screaming in the public about how terrible the healthcare system is. The Affordable Care Act was not perfect by a darn sight, but 26 million Americans have health insurance now who wouldn't have had it if it weren't for that. And there was no viable alternative presented. And kids who had pre-existing healthcare conditions can also buy insurance. So I don't want to relitigate that, but the Democrats have not been good about saying what they do well. On top of that, our message is really muddled. If you ask, what's the Republican message? You know, it's smaller government, lower taxes, less regulation, control immigration, get back to Jesus or something. I mean, it's sort of that package, but they can all say it, and they all do say it. When you ask the Democrats, we're kind of all over the map. And then frankly, as we've alluded to earlier, Democrats tend not to be cult of personality kind of people. You see far more Trump signs up than you see Democratic yard signs up. Democrats are policy oriented. And then we tend also to say, well, I like you on 8 out of 10 things, but because I disagree with you on 2, I'm just not going to support you. So we've got to get our message tighter. We've got to get younger candidates. We've got to stop sort of appealing to niche issues and start talking about the bread and butter issues, and then talk about more effectively about the things we actually have done right. And then last but not least, it is pretty frightening. The Republican Party on an issue, an existential issue for the planet like climate change, has been wrong, in my judgment, just dead wrong. And it's cost the entire planet Earth that party has just denied the science. The Democrats really need to try to cut through that in some constructive ways. And we haven't effectively done it. And sadly, I don't think President Biden, and I like these people, President Biden, Nancy Pelosi, et cetera, have been our most powerful messengers on that. And they certainly haven't connected to rural America in any powerful or effective way. And we need that. We need to connect to rural America.
Yeah, I agree with Brian. I think the Democrats, you know, there's a fact that I heard recently that is alarming, and that is the 3 richest people in America have a net worth that is greater than the bottom 50% of the country. So that's the wealth gap that people talk about, particularly Democrats talk about, and Bernie Sanders talks about incessantly. But that's a problem, and that may be the reason for some of the acrimony in our country, because of that huge wealth gap. And the Democrats need to talk about that issue, but do it in a way where they don't attack business. You know, at one point, you know, Obama, basically as a business person, that's my background, I felt like, you know, President Obama and the Democrats really didn't appreciate what business brought to the table in our country. And the Democrats need to get their message across, whether it's climate or taxes or spending. They need to talk about it in a way where business doesn't feel threatened. They need to pay their fair share, and the regulatory environment needs to be reasonable so we don't create unnecessary burdens. But the wealth gap is an issue that I think people need to understand better.
And Dave, I think you're absolutely right. We can talk about the wealth gap without berating small business or threatening small business. And when we throw regulation after regulation after regulation, or tax after tax after tax, it alienates small businesses. And small businesses are hardworking, decent folks. And frankly, big corporations do a lot of good. You look at the charitable contributions of Microsoft and its shareholders and its workers, remarkable. We've got to just stop denigrating it. We've just got to stop reflexively yelling about how corporations are bad and evil. Some do remarkably good things, and they employ a hell of a lot of people. And that, if we'd stop that stuff and still talk about the wealth gap. One thing we haven't mentioned, I'm really concerned about people like Elon Musk and the amount of wealth. And I don't know who gave him outer space, but it's really shocking to me that one individual somehow got possession of a significant portion of space. What I mean is his threat to cut off support for Ukraine access to Starlink. I don't know how one guy and his company got all that control, but we ought to be collectively, globally asking that question. And Elon Musk, anybody with the kind of money he's got, more than $200 billion, wields unnecessary and unstable and really a dangerous level of power, I think.
Havertz, do you have a comment on that? This would be the last.
I think we covered it all. I think the messaging, as you pointed out, Brian, is so important for the Democrats. Also, I think from a European perspective, what you have to understand is that the Democratic Party has, I mean, so many people try to find a home under that umbrella. And in Germany, they would have they can pick between 3 different parties. And here it's okay, like, take it or leave it, because here's the Democrats. And that is also a problem, of course, within the Democratic Party. That's in part Joe Biden's problem. It's like, if he does one thing, the progressives are going to say, why are you doing that? If he's like too leaning towards to the progressive side, then the moderates are saying, I mean, Joe Manchin, I mean, we haven't talked about Joe Manchin yet. I mean, he was the kingmaker, and he was like, everything Joe Manchin in the Senate didn't like, Biden couldn't push, because he made himself the decisive vote. Why didn't make Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren make themselves the decisive vote? Because they weren't as ruthless as Joe Manchin, who would just say, I'm not doing it. I'm not voting for this. It's too progressive. It's too bad for my own state. So I think that's also part, of course, as the Democratic Party progresses into the future. And I mean, then we haven't talked about who's going to run 2024. That's going to be a huge problem. Joe Biden, really? I don't think, I mean, he shouldn't be the guy. Me personally, I don't think he should be that one. Kamala Harris hasn't found her footing in the VP office at all. And Joe Biden didn't really give her any chance. She has topics that are important, but that are not winning issues. Immigration, voting rights. I mean, nothing you can go out and say, hey, I accomplished this. Go vote for me. So who's going to show up 2024? Pete Buttigieg, maybe a bit too soon. So, I mean, that's the intrinsic problems the Democratic Party have. And then you have a Republican Party that have the MAGA extremes, but still they're on message most of the time.
Yeah.
But it's pretty clear that a Biard Trott ticket would solve all these problems. Wouldn't you say, Brian?
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that, Dave. I'll share a tiny anecdote. But my friend Bob Inglis from South Carolina, Bob was a climate believer. He believed climate change was real, and he believed in free market carbon tax as the solution. He lost a 5-way primary just because he believed in climate change. That's how extreme it is. If you just as a Republican say climate change is real. But I joked with Bob because we were on the same committee. And I said, Bob, why don't you and I run for president? It was a joke. And I said, but what we'll do is we'll announce we're running, and then we'll flip a coin to see who gets to be president, who gets to be vice president, to symbolize that it's not about one or another personality or party. It's about doing what's good for the country. I saw Bob the next day on the House floor, and I said, good afternoon, Mr. President. He said, no, I won the coin toss. But in all seriousness, it could be a very powerful message if a prominent Republican, I mean this seriously, and a prominent Democrat or independent came together and said, we're going to run for president, vice president, and we're going to flip a coin to see who's either. Because it should not be about personality, and it should not be about party. And then we'll run together and we'll work together for common ground. You know, I'm in, Dave.
We all know that, you know, that's what McCain wanted in 12. He wanted Joe Lieberman as his running mate.
Yeah.
And
they should have done it. He'd be president today.
The advisor said to him, you know, you can't pick Lieberman. He's a Democrat, and, you know, the base will go crazy on you. And he had a temper tantrum, and that's how we got Sarah Palin. So
didn't work out.
Well, I think we can end on that wonderful note. 2024, Trott, Biard. I look forward to this nomination and following those activities politically. Yeah, that marks the end of our event. I'll turn it over to Katrina Kiesel.
Yeah, what a wonderful and interesting discussion. Thank you so much. I mean, it's getting pretty late here in Germany, and I will keep it short. Christopher Ochoa, thank you so much for this wonderful moderation. And of course, a big thanks to our speakers, Rieke, Havertz, Dave, Trott, and Brian Biard. Thank you so much for being here. Also
Thanks,
to our cooperation
Thank you, it was a
partners.
pleasure.
Friedrich Foundation for Freedom, you heard Iris before, the Political Adult Education in Cologne, and of course the Association of Former Members of Congress. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And of course to my team in the background, Ida Görlitz and Fine Wittmann. Dear guests, thank you for attending. And if you enjoyed tonight, please do come back. Check out our events on our webpage and have a great evening. Thank you so much. Goodbye and have a great time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.